Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is a pro-revenge story. My dad, Jack, passed away on March 15th, 2025. He lived with me briefly before his death, following a long period of chronic illness spanning over 15 years. As his health deteriorated, he relied more on my mom, Sarah, for assistance. She had never been a great person, and she fully exploited his disability and mobility issues as he declined. For years, she claimed to be separated and divorced, chatting with other men online. She frequently declared her intention to move away and marry someone else. Moreover, she took advantage of him financially. We explored every legal avenue we could find to have her evicted, arrested, or forced out, but our attempts were met with responses that it was a civil matter and nothing could be done. Dad made me his durable power of attorney and added me to all his accounts. One day I confronted Sarah about her behavior. "How can you treat Dad this way after everything he's done for you?" I asked. She scoffed. "You don't understand our relationship. Mind your own business." "This is my business," I retorted. "He's my father, and I won't stand by while you mistreat him." I had tried for years to convince Dad to move in with me, but he refused to leave the house he had worked so hard to pay for. "Son, I appreciate your concern," he'd say, "but this is my home. I can't just leave it behind." I brought him home on hospice the day after Thanksgiving and ensured his final days were as comfortable as possible. After meeting with the funeral home to carry out his final wishes, I was informed they required consent from my mother to allow me to cremate him. Unsurprisingly, she initially refused. "I won't allow it," she said firmly. "Mom, this is what Dad wanted," I pleaded. "I don't care, it's not happening," she insisted. She only agreed after I allowed her to keep the Social Security survivor benefits, which would have been hers anyway. I wrote Dad's obituary and deliberately left her out of it. There wasn't a single word or mention that he had ever been married or had a spouse. I didn't believe she deserved to be recognized or viewed as a grieving widow when she had spent their marriage as a terrible spouse in person. She was furious, and there were numerous questions from friends and family. "Where's Sarah's name in the obituary?" my aunt asked. "I chose not to include her," I replied simply. "But why?" she pressed. "There are reasons," I said, leaving it at that. I've spent years in therapy working through maternal narcissistic abuse, and I believe if she didn't want me to talk about it, she shouldn't have done it. When people inquired about the situation, I was honest about the years of abuse my father and I endured from her. I've completely shattered the public image and victim complex she had spent years cultivating. "Your mother is devastated," a family friend told me. "She says you're spreading lies about her." "I'm only telling the truth," I responded. "If she's upset, it's because her actions are finally coming to light." I might be viewed as the villain in this scenario, but I would do it again in a heartbeat. The truth needed to be told, and I refused to perpetuate the facade of a loving family when the reality was so different. The next one is an entitled People's Story. I never thought I'd be writing one of these stories, but here I am. It all started when my wife and I bought our dream home last year, a cozy little house at the end of a long private road surrounded by woods. We loved the peace and quiet. The only downside was our next-door neighbor, Karen. From day one, Karen made it clear she didn't like us. She'd glare whenever we drove by and once yelled at us for having friends over, claiming we were disturbing the tranquility. We tried to keep the peace, but nothing seemed to satisfy her. Things came to a head last month. I was heading to work when I noticed a giant yellow bulldozer parked at the entrance to our road. Confused, I got out to investigate. That's when Karen marched up, practically frothing at the mouth. "It's about time you learn your place around here," she shrieked. "This road is mine, and I'm tearing it up. You have no right to use it anymore." I was stunned. "What are you talking about? This is a shared private road. We have an easement to use it," Karen sneered. "Not anymore. I own this land, and I'm revoking your access. You'll have to find another way to your house." My mind was reeling. Our property would be landlocked without this road. There was no other way in or out. "You can't do this," I protested. "It's illegal. We have a legal right to access our property." "Watch me," Karen spat. She stomped over to the bulldozer and climbed in. I called the police in a panic, explaining the situation. They said they'd send someone out, but it would take a while. Meanwhile, Karen fired up the bulldozer and started tearing into the road. I stood in front of the bulldozer, trying to reason with her. "Karen, please stop! This is insane! You're breaking the law!" She just cackled maniacally and kept plowing forward. I had to jump out of the way to avoid being run over. All I could do was watch helplessly as she ripped up huge chunks of asphalt. After what felt like hours, a police cruiser finally pulled up. 2 officers got out, looking bewildered at the scene before them. "Ma'am, you need to stop the bulldozer immediately," one officer called out. Karen ignored them completely, continuing to gleefully destroy the road. The officers approached cautiously. "Ma'am, this is your final warning. Stop the vehicle now or we will be forced to remove you." When Karen still didn't respond, the officers climbed up and forcibly pulled her out of the bulldozer. She thrashed and screeched like a wild animal as they handcuffed her. "You can't arrest me," she wailed. "I own this land. They're the trespassers." I explained the situation to the officers, how it was a shared private road that we had a legal easement to use. They nodded sympathetically. "We'll need to see documentation, but it sounds like she had no right to do this," one officer said. "She'll be charged with destruction of property, at minimum." As they put Karen in the back of the cruiser, she was still ranting about how the road belonged to her. The officers assured me they'd be in touch about pressing charges. I called my boss to explain why I'd be late, then spent the rest of the morning documenting the damage and calling our insurance company. The road was torn up for a good 50 feet. It would cost thousands to repair. Over the next few weeks, the legal process unfolded. It turned out Karen had zero claim to the road. Her property line ended at the edge of it just like ours did. The easement was ironclad. We had every right to use the road to access our home. Karen was charged with felony destruction of property, along with a few other charges. She tried to claim she honestly thought she owned the road, but emails were uncovered showing she knew about the easement and was trying to force us out. In the end, Karen took a plea deal to avoid jail time. She had to pay a huge fine, cover the cost of road repairs, and was sentenced to 500 hours of community service. She also had to take anger management classes and was barred from coming near our property. The icing on the cake? Karen had to sell her house to pay for everything. Last we heard, she moved across the country to live with her sister. Good riddance. It took a while, but the road was finally repaired last week. Things are peaceful again. No more angry glares or shouted insults when we drive by. We can enjoy our home the way we always wanted to. I still can't believe how crazy the whole situation was. Who bulldozes a road in a delusional attempt to screw over their neighbors? I'm just glad justice was served in the end. Let this be a lesson to entitled people everywhere. Your actions have consequences. The next one is a petty revenge story. First time posting here. I have a disability parking permit, and my local supermarket has a disability parking slot. I would normally park nose in, but just this morning the adjacent car had chosen to not care about parking properly and had parked about 5 centimeters 2 inches into the disabled bay. I had to reverse my car into the disabled slot so that there was enough space for it to exit out of my car. There was very little space between the two cars. I was having a chat with a local retiree just outside the store when we saw the offending parker return to her car. I had told him about how poorly that driver had parked her car and what I had done. He was smiling while watching the unparking sequence unfolded. That driver had to slowly reverse out to straighten up her steering before moving forward and away from my car. She had then gotten out of her car to check on the spacing that she had provided herself before getting back in to reverse her car out again to leave. I'm hoping that she had learnt her lesson about parking properly. Perhaps she had obtained the registration number of my car so that she can track down the owner of the car so that she can execute her brand of petty revenge upon me. The next one is a malicious compliance story. I've been teaching for 6 years at my last school for 2 years. I have a BA in history and MA in education. My principal and administrative staff pulled me out of one of my classes during an intense lecture I was giving and ambushed me in the hallway to tell me I was going to teach IB classes next year. For those unaware, International Baccalaureate courses are intense classes for high school students that last from 1-2 years. These classes are intense, requiring what some teachers have said to be the time equivalent of a part-time job for them to plan and prepare, without additional pay and not part of my contract. For context, within the first 2 weeks of working at this school, I noticed the other side of the pendulum. The students with learning challenges were being pushed aside in order to achieve the principal's goals of becoming an elite IB school. I began advocating for these students and offered to teach co-taught class with a special education teacher in order to help these students achieve. It was a great success, seeing many of the former troubled students actively being engaged in class, and through the grapevine, I was told I was one of their favorite teachers since I got them. After the first semester, I heavily petitioned the staff to allow me to teach more of these specialized classes across my department. Here's the deal. There was no change in the curriculum, just in how I presented it to the shared class. Anyhow, the principal shot down my idea, but allowed me to continue with my lone class for the next year. Back to the present. After the ambush, I went home and talked it over with my wife. She is my rock and understood that I was troubled with the additional task of basically adding an additional 15 hours of work a week to my schedule. She said, Go with your heart. The next week, I scheduled a meeting with the principal. I told him I was unprepared to teach the IB course this year, but if he would give me this year to prepare the additional materials and create a curriculum, I would be good to go for the next. I also asked if there were any other additional classes he would like for me to put together to teach next year. He said, no, teach this course next year or look for another job. I asked about additional co-taught courses for the shared students who were overlooked. He said they were not important. I reminded him, yet again, I was currently working toward my PhD in history in order to teach college-level courses in high school so students could get dual credit and a jump on college and tech schools. He laughed at me and said, I quote, none of the additional education you have taken since you started working here benefits the school at all. No one cares. This took the wind out of me. I love teaching. All of the additional work, time, and effort spent away from my family has been in order to be a better teacher, a better example for my students. I told him I would need to think about this, and quietly left the room. I took the next day off, spending time with my family and speaking with my therapist. I am very lucky to have a wonderful support system. I went back to work after that, and there were a number of staff that spoke to me privately. They agreed what he said was shameful. They shared that I was not the only teacher he spoke to this way, from changing failing grades to passing, to having teachers sponsor multiple extracurricular clubs without pay. I went to my union rep and added my statement to his ever-growing pile of staff statements about the principal. I assured him I was willing to go to the school board, etc. Just give me a call. Yep, I decided I was done. I wrote the principal an outstanding resignation letter, full of positivity and thanking him for the wonderful opportunity to work at his school and to have learned from his outstanding example of leadership. Did I also mention I forwarded the email to the entire staff? There was no way he could publicly respond negatively to my resignation, and he was furious. The majority of the staff knew what was going on. There were many smiles and fist bumps. I was told by the office staff later there were 5 other teachers that resigned, making this the biggest turnover in staff in a decade. The principal now has to go before the school board next month to explain what is happening at his school. I wonder if I'm going to get a call. The next one is an entitled People story. I lived with my sister a few years ago. While I did, I was there to help her with the house, cleaning, my nephew, etc. However, things didn't go down like that. When I moved in, my nephew was around 5-ish, and I, being his aunt, believed that being older than him, I may have some authority living in their house. Turns out, I was wrong. He had more than me. He didn't have to listen to me. He didn't have to help me clean when I asked. I wasn't even an ass about it. They, for some reason, believed I was, though, saying things like, will you help me please clean up in here? IDK what all this stuff is or where it goes. I never spent time in the living room, mostly was secluded in my room, then was ignored for some video game or told to hold on. So I would ask again, hey, come on, please help me get this done for your mom while she's working, so everything's done when she's off work, please. Then I would get all whiny while I'm in the process of cleaning half of it already. Eventually, he'd go and bother his mom at work, and I'd be told by him that he doesn't have to do anything and to just leave him to play his games. The real kicker was when he'd get mad at me and tell me to just go to my room, though. Now that one, whoa, Nelly, that one was something else. Having his mom do nothing about it, well, that was even better. Well, she decided that when I house sat for my folks for 6 days while they were out of town and needed their cats to be watched. Since she was unemployed, she couldn't clean up after herself, her husband, and kid, and kicked me out. Now she is understanding the karma of that. I put up with her and her family straight up, treating me like a second-class citizen because I needed the roof over my head. I have been fighting the government to get my disability for years. I'm really ill, and her family treated me like I was a hypochondriac for 5 years. I was always overworking myself for them to make sure things were clean. Yes, there were days when I was just too sick, but I tried my hardest, pushing myself past my limits constantly. It was obvious I was very sick. I ballooned up to 275 pounds and then suddenly lost 105 pounds in just 1 year. I kept hearing my sister say, "Must be nice." It wasn't nice. It was god-awful. I had no idea why I was rapidly losing weight without trying, because I was having a flare from all the stress I was under, apparently. Literally, 7 days after I moved out, I was diagnosed with 2 very rare diseases that are hard to detect. I even had to have major surgery just a few months later on my arteries because of the state of one of them because of one of my diseases. Do I get an apology for how I was treated? Nope. Do I still hear her saying the phrase, well, she is a hypochondriac too? Every time I look at her echoing in my head? Most definitely. Now she is dealing with my nephew who won't listen to her, won't do his schoolwork, argues back with her constantly, treats her like they let him treat me. While I was living there, when he started treating his mom like crap, I came to her defense. I told him it was not okay to disrespect his mother that way, that he shouldn't be disrespectful to her at all. To knock it off. 9/10 I was able to de-escalate. Not every time. Mainly because I wasn't allowed, nay, I was treated as though I was not a person in his life who had any authority over him. His other aunts and uncle did, though. Why? I think in their minds it all boils down to the fact that I don't have children. I wouldn't understand how to raise one. Now, I see it very simply. You don't need to have a child to have common sense, patience, intelligence, the ability to actually listen, and the ability to treat a child like it's a human being with intelligence of its own. If you actually listen patiently to what is being said by the child, you can have the common sense and intelligence to know whether or not they are playing you. You talk to them like they are people, not an idiot just because of their age, which most times tends to make things worse. You talk to them calmly and make them calmer by explaining that yelling at me isn't going to help me help you, and there you have it. If they trusted me enough to patch up their kids' wounds or get out their splinters, why wasn't I trusted enough to help them with their homework or teach them when they needed homeschooling? I am smart. I'm pretty sure I could have helped a bunch of 3rd or 4th graders. I'm just saying. They let me babysit, but I had no authority. Her kid would take his phone and sneak off, call his folks, and tattle on me if I ever wanted him to clean up after himself with his cousins. He blamed all messes made on his cousins, too. Now I am not there to help her. No one else helps her. She is left alone to deal with the mess she made, and part of me feels bad. Part of me does want to go over and help her. Then I remember that I have no authority, so what exactly would be the point? I would get there just to stand there. I think the best part of it all is that they are mad at me because I wasn't able to get back to finish cleaning up after I moved my things out. I don't drive. I had to move 35 minutes away from where I was living. I had no way there. Also, the situation I was put into was really no better than what I was already in. It's just a different setup with less yelling. The fact that they are mad at me at all and are still treating me with disdain and have yet to attempt any kind of apology for just being so awful to me is just too funny. I will forever have permanent mental scars from my time living there. I moved out at the end of 2022, and the thought of all of it still brings me to tears. The next one is an entitled parent's story. Here's the corrected version of the story. So, I've, 23F, been fighting against obesity for some years now. It's not that I was obese my whole life. When I was a child, I was pretty thin, but not entirely for the right reasons. The first reason I was thin is that I was quite active and passionate about martial arts. The second reason was that my parents hated the idea of me getting fat, really hated it. Since they knew I had genetic tendencies toward obesity, they acted super restrictively with my diet in an almost maniacal way. For example, if someone gave me an Easter egg, they would take it away and give it to someone else. If I was caught eating something they disapproved of, they would physically and verbally abuse me. They also constantly shamed me about my body, even though I was skinny, as I said, and terrified me about losing friends or not being loved if I gained weight. I remember my father frequently telling me that the world belongs to thin people, using those exact words. So I kept going like that until I was old enough to have some money and made the discovery that if I bought things with my own money and ate at school or elsewhere away from home, my parents couldn't control what I ate. That's when I started getting addicted to sugar and began eating compulsively every time I left home, which is how I started gaining weight. When I became an adult, I tried to lose weight in many ways, mostly without my parents' help because I couldn't trust them. However, 3 years ago, a series of unfortunate events, including my grandparents passing and my sister's drug addiction, I won't talk about that now, forced me to make the choice to try trusting my parents again. I think the pain humbled them somewhat, so they became more tolerable. Gradually, I decided to talk to my parents about my body insecurities and health issues, and they seemed somewhat understanding. At the time, I was somewhat scared of the idea of surgical intervention, but my parents began making the idea more appealing to me, no pun intended. After 2 years of discussion and promises, I decided to go ahead and say yes to bariatric surgery, a decision that made my parents literally weep. They helped with all the bureaucracy, promised to take good care of me, and be with me throughout the process. I think I've never felt so close to them. Then, the surgery came, and the nightmare began. First, there was the issue of the room. My room is on the 2nd floor, and the only other room on the 1st floor is a small one that's as good as Harry Potter's closet. Months earlier, we had agreed that I would stay in my room on the 2nd floor with them bringing me food and medication. However, as soon as I entered the house, my mother insisted that I go to the Harry Potter room, which I refused, thinking nothing bad would happen. On the first day, they took good care of me with smiles. By the second day, they began complaining about how lazy I was and how I was making their lives difficult by not going downstairs to do things. they started guilt-tripping me into doing things the doctor had forbidden, like going up and down the stairs to get my food and medications or taking care of the dogs. One day, my mother scolded me for refusing to help her with the garden, something I usually do, out of fear of infection. After 4 days, they stopped making the foods I needed, so I had to go all the way to the kitchen and force myself to cook, even though the doctor said I shouldn't go near the stove. Every time I complained that they weren't helping me as they were supposed to, they blamed me for refusing to stay in the Harry Potter room. When I reminded them that we had agreed the room wasn't suitable for someone recovering from surgery, they tried to gaslight me, insisting we'd never had that conversation, and that I chose to stay in my room out of stubbornness. A few days ago, my mother threatened to give away my dogs if I didn't start caring for them again, so I started doing it. I think the pinnacle was today, when I had to go to the nutritionist to change my diet, and my mother, who is required to accompany me since she signed a contract as my caretaker, not only refused to help me put on my orthopedic socks, which I need to wear and can't put on by myself, by saying it was unnecessary. It wasn't. But she also made the appointment with the nutritionist very uncomfortable by telling the lady that I had privately mentioned finding her voice annoying. I was so embarrassed I didn't know where to look, and the doctor seemed uncomfortable too. When we left, I told my mother it was unnecessary and that I didn't appreciate what she did. Again, she became enraged and said she wouldn't bother to accompany me to the next appointment, which is today. So, I'll have to expose my weakened immune system by taking an Uber or asking a friend to take me. Again, she signed a contract and is required to accompany me. It's been almost 2 weeks since the surgery, and by now I not only feel abandoned, but also deeply regret trusting them with my health. In the end, me getting thinner is something they want, not because it's good for me, but because they can't stand the idea of me being fat. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.